Please subscribe and share for more story. The words came out of her son's mouth like a command, sharp and humiliating. You either give my wife your room or you pack your bags. Leonard Brooks didn't lower his voice. He didn't hesitate. He shouted it across the dining table as if issuing orders at work. Margaret Hale, 68 years old, sat frozen in her chair. The Sunday dinner she had cooked herself, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, suddenly felt like a performance she had failed. Leonard's wife, Vanessa, sat beside him, lips curved in a small, knowing smile. Margaret noticed how Vanessa avoided her eyes, already confident she would win. Around the table, silence spread. Margaret's sister-in-law, Elaine, stared hard at her plate. 7-year-old Emma, Margaret's granddaughter, folded her hands tightly in her lap. No one spoke. No one defended her. Margaret felt something inside her crack, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. Her son was evicting her from her own bedroom, in her own house, the house she had paid for. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She placed her fork and knife down carefully and said calmly, "That's fine, Leonard. I'll pack my bags." The silence that followed was thick and stunned. Leonard blinked, clearly confused. He had expected resistance, tears, guilt, maybe a lecture. Vanessa let out a short laugh and quickly coughed to cover it. Elaine shifted in her chair. Emma looked up at her grandmother with wide, uncertain eyes. Margaret stood, folded her napkin, and placed it beside her plate. Her hands didn't shake. She walked away from the table with her back straight, refusing to look at any of them. Later that night, while laughter and clinking glasses resumed downstairs, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was searching. Weeks earlier, her best friend Carol had sent her a real estate listing she had laughed off as a fantasy, a small blue cottage on Seabrook Island, 2 hours from Atlanta. Someday, Carol had written, "We'll sit on that deck and drink wine at sunset." That night, Margaret opened the message again. The house had 2 bedrooms, ocean views, and a price that fit neatly into her savings. For the first time in decades, a thought made her feel dizzy with freedom. This money is mine. Margaret opened her banking app. $208,000 sat quietly in her savings. Money earned from decades of nursing double shifts, skipped vacations, and saying no to herself. She thought of everything she had paid for. Leonard's college tuition. Leonard's first car. His expensive wedding. The $10,000 she had given him when his business failed. She had never asked for it back. Her late husband, Robert, had left her a small life insurance policy she had never touched. She had enough. More than enough. The realization settled into her bones like strength. The next morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Margaret called the real estate agent listed on the Seabrook Island property. A cheerful young woman answered. "I'd like to see the house today," Margaret said. There was a pause. "I can meet you at 11, the agent replied. "Perfect," Margaret said. She hung up and stared at her phone. She had crossed an invisible line. At 9, Leonard came downstairs yawning. "Is breakfast ready?" he asked. "No," Margaret replied, not looking up. "I'm going out." "Where?" he demanded. "I have an appointment." He frowned but said nothing. For the first time, she didn't explain herself. Margaret dressed simply, jeans, a white blouse, walking shoes. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was gray, her face lined, but her eyes were clear. She left the house at 10:30, without saying goodbye. Leonard watched television. Vanessa slept upstairs in Margaret's former room. No one stopped her. The drive felt unreal. She rolled the windows down, played old songs from her youth, and sang badly, laughing to herself. For the first time in years, no one needed anything from her. The ocean air hit her face as she arrived at the cottage at 11 sharp. The house was even more beautiful in person, bright, peaceful, facing endless water. The agent smiled. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Margaret replied, voice thick. "You'd like to think about it?" the agent suggested. "No," Margaret said. "I want to buy it now." The agent blinked, then smiled wider. Are you sure? I've been making decisions for everyone else for 68 years, Margaret said. This one is for me. She signed the papers right there. When she stepped onto the deck, watching the waves roll in and out without asking for anything, she felt calm for the first time in her life. Margaret sent Carol a photo of the horizon. I did it, she texted. Carol called immediately, shouting with joy. What happened? Carol asked. Leonard told me to pack my bags, Margaret replied calmly. So I am. She drove home slowly that evening, peaceful. When she arrived, Leonard barely looked up. Where were you? Handling things, Margaret replied. She went to the small den, the room she had been pushed into, and began packing. Clothes first, documents, jewelry, photographs that mattered. No one came to check on her. At 10, Leonard shouted, Are you making dinner? No, she replied. Order something. The next morning, Margaret called Carol again. I need you to come with me to a lawyer, she said. I'm selling the house. Carol arrived in 30 minutes. Margaret ate breakfast alone. She contacted a lawyer she trusted and scheduled an appointment. The house was listed that same day. 3 days later, offers started coming in. Margaret didn't feel nervous. She felt ready. Life inside the house became a quiet war. Leonard and Vanessa settled fully into Margaret's bedroom. Vanessa handed Margaret a shopping list one afternoon. We're hosting friends. Buy this. Margaret looked at the expensive items. Who's paying? She asked. Vanessa blinked. You are. Margaret folded the list. No, Vanessa stared. What's wrong with you? Nothing, Margaret replied. I'm just done. Leonard stormed in. Why are you being difficult? Because you treat me like staff, Margaret said calmly. The agent called the next day. We have a cash offer, he said. Margaret accepted immediately. She updated her will. Her granddaughter Emma would inherit most of her assets. Leonard would receive less, with a clause preventing contests. When Leonard and Vanessa announced they wanted to live in the house permanently, Margaret said simply, No, Leonard shouted. Vanessa cried. Margaret stayed calm. You're adults, she said. Solve your own problems. The truth shocked them more than anger ever could. The final days passed quickly. Margaret packed quietly, moving boxes to storage. Leonard noticed the distance but assumed she would give in. On Wednesday night, Leonard knocked on her door. I don't want us fighting, he said. We're not, Margaret replied. I'm just finished. He asked how to fix it. You can't, she said. Thursday morning, Margaret signed the final papers. The house was sold. That evening, she sat Leonard and Vanessa down. I sold the house, she said. The chaos erupted. Leonard shouted. Vanessa panicked. Margaret stayed calm. You have 3 days, she said. This is legal. She walked away while they screamed. That night, she slept peacefully. On Sunday morning, Margaret left with Carol. Leonard stood on the porch, lost. Take care, Margaret said gently. She didn't look back. The beach house welcomed her with sunlight and quiet. Margaret sat on the deck with wine, listening to the waves. Weeks later, Emma visited. You deserve this, her granddaughter said. Months later, a letter arrived from Leonard. He apologized. He was in therapy. Margaret cried, not from pain, but from relief. She framed a photo of Leonard as a child and placed it beside the ocean view. Margaret Hale was no longer just a mother, a widow, a caregiver. She was herself, and she was finally at peace. The first full morning in the cottage felt unreal to Margaret Hale. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, painting soft patterns on the wooden floor. She woke to the sound of waves, not voices demanding things from her. She made coffee slowly, savoring the quiet. So this is peace, she murmured. No rushing. No tension. She carried her mug to the deck and sat down, letting the breeze brush her face. For the first time since Robert's death, the loneliness didn't hurt. It felt chosen. Her phone buzzed. A message from Leonard. Mom, we need to talk. Margaret read it, then turned the phone face down. Not today, she said aloud. She spent the morning unpacking only what she needed, leaving boxes untouched. She wasn't trying to recreate her old life. She was building a new one. At noon, she walked barefoot along the beach, watching couples, families, and dogs run past. No one knew her here. No one expected anything from her. That anonymity felt like freedom. That night, she cooked a simple dinner for herself and ate it on the deck. No criticism. No silence heavy with resentment. Just the ocean and her thoughts. 2 days later, Margaret joined a small walking group she'd seen near the pier. "You must be new," a woman with silver curls said warmly. "I'm Nora." "Margaret," she replied. "Just moved in." The women welcomed her easily. Widows. Divorcees. Women who had also started over later in life. As they walked, conversation flowed. "Why Seabrook Island?" Nora asked. Margaret smiled. "Because it was time." No one pushed for more. That afternoon, Leonard called again. Margaret let it ring. When she checked her voicemail later, his voice was tight. "Mom, Julia is furious. We're struggling. You didn't have to do this." Margaret listened calmly. "I didn't have to stay either," she said quietly after the message ended. She deleted it. That evening, Carol arrived with a suitcase and a bottle of wine. "I'm staying a week," she announced. Margaret laughed. "Good. I need witnesses to my happiness." They toasted on the deck, watching the sky turn pink. "You know," Carol said, "he thought you'd never leave." Margaret nodded. "So did I." Back in Atlanta, Leonard's world was unraveling. Margaret didn't know the details at first, only fragments from missed calls and short messages. "Mom, we're at a hotel." "Mom, this is harder than we thought."
She didn't respond.
Silence, she knew now, wasn't cruelty. It was boundaries. One afternoon, her granddaughter Emma called. "Grandma," the girl said softly, "are you mad at Daddy?" Margaret paused.
"No, sweetheart."
"I'm just taking care of myself." Emma hesitated. "I'm glad," she said. "He was wrong to yell at you." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, Margaret wrote in a notebook she had bought on impulse. "I am allowed to choose myself." She underlined it twice. She slept deeply, without guilt pulling her awake. The waves outside were steady, constant. They didn't argue. They didn't demand. They simply existed. And so did she. A week later, Leonard showed up unannounced. Margaret saw his car from the deck and felt her stomach tighten, but not with fear, with resolve. He looked smaller somehow, standing awkwardly by the gate. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" She nodded and gestured to the deck chairs. He didn't sit at first. "I didn't think you'd actually leave," he admitted. "I thought you were bluffing." Margaret met his eyes. "That's the problem, Leonard. You thought I was a reaction, not a person." He swallowed. "I messed up." "You didn't just mess up," she said calmly. "You took me for granted for years." He sat down heavily. "I didn't realize how much you did." Margaret shook her head.
"You realized."
"You just assumed it would never stop." He looked down. "Julia and I are separating." Margaret felt no triumph, only sadness. "I hope you both find what you need," she said. He looked surprised. "You're not angry?" "I was," she replied. "Now I'm just honest." He asked for forgiveness. Margaret didn't give it, not yet. "Healing takes time," she said. "For both of us." After Leonard left, Margaret sat alone, shaken but steady. Confrontation no longer drained her. It clarified her. She joined a pottery class the next week. Her hands, once used only for caregiving, learned something new. She laughed when her first bowl collapsed. "So, that's what failure without consequences feels like," she joked. She made friends. She cooked when she wanted, rested when she wanted, spoke when she wanted. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Leonard had written it by hand. He apologized without excuses. He admitted therapy was hard. He admitted he had used her. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. She wasn't ready to answer, but she didn't throw it away either. That night, she stood on the deck watching the sunset, orange bleeding into purple. "You didn't disappear," she told herself. "You arrived." Months passed. Margaret's routine settled gently. Morning walks. Coffee on the deck. Laughter with new friends. Emma visited often, sleeping in the second bedroom and filling the house with quiet joy. "This feels like you," Emma said once. Margaret smiled. "It finally is." Leonard called less frequently, but when he did, his tone was different. Respectful. Careful. One evening, he said, "I never learned how to stand on my own." Margaret replied, "Now you can." She didn't rescue him. She didn't guide every step. And slowly he grew. She saw it in his words, in his pauses. Growth, she learned, came when she stepped back. On her 69th birthday, Margaret hosted a small dinner. Just friends. Just laughter. Carol raised her glass. "To the woman who taught us it's never too late." Margaret felt emotion rise in her throat. "To all of us," she said. That night, she slept with the windows open, listening to the sea. She dreamed of Robert, not sick, not tired, but smiling. When she woke, she didn't feel grief. She felt gratitude. Life had given her another chapter, and she was finally writing it herself. A year later, Margaret received a final letter from Leonard. He thanked her, not for money, not for help, but for leaving. "You forced me to grow," he wrote. She smiled and placed the letter beside the photo of Emma. Forgiveness came quietly, without ceremony. It felt light, necessary. Margaret no longer measured her worth by sacrifice. She measured it by peace, by laughter,
By choice.
She volunteered at the local clinic twice a week, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Giving now felt different, freer. Sometimes she thought about the old house, the dining table, the silence. She didn't miss it. That chapter had ended exactly when it needed to. Margaret learned that love without boundaries was just slow erosion. And boundaries weren't walls. They were doors she could choose to open or close. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Carol asked, "Would you do it again?" Margaret didn't hesitate.
"Yes," she said.
"Earlier, if I could." She had lost a role, but gained herself. And that trade felt fair. Margaret Hale was no longer defined by what she gave up. She was defined by what she chose. By the woman who finally said no and meant it. And every night, as the waves rolled in without asking permission, Margaret sat on her deck, breathed deeply, and smiled, finally, completely at peace. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.